Welcome everyone to today's webinar organized by the International Institute for Sustainable Development with support from WWF. I am Shruti Sharma. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor with IISD's program in India. I have the privilege of moderating today's webinar, and that is focused on exploring the case for gas-fired power in South Africa. And we have an exciting agenda today. We'll open with some thoughts from Ellen Davies, then listen to my colleague Richard Halsey present findings from IISD's report. And then we'll follow it up with a panel discussion. We have some experts today, which is great. And we'll lastly finish with a Q&A. We want to encourage participation from all of you. So please use the Q&A box at the end. I'm moderating it, I assure you, and so are my colleagues. We encourage participation of representatives from the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. We are the Chief Director for Energy Planning and ESCOM. We are the Just Energy Transition Office and the Head of Planning and Modeling, but unfortunately, no representatives from those offices have joined us today. But nevertheless, before we kick off, I look forward to all your questions. Again, just a reminder to please put them in the chat box and the Q&A box. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ellen Davies. She leads the African Climate Foundation's research work and brings in a rich decade-long experience in sustainable economic development. Ellen, many thanks for joining us today, and over to you for welcome comments.
Thank you, and good morning to all the panelists and to the participants. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to keep my introductory remarks short so that we can really get to the meat and bones of the important discussion and unpack the important contribution that the IISD report makes. I think I want to make two points to really kind of frame the current debates around gas in South Africa, first in the broader African context, and then in the broader global context. So first, from an African perspective, I think it's abundantly clear that Africa is fast becoming the new frontier for oil and gas companies. In the past decade, over 40% of new gas discoveries have been in Africa. And oil and gas companies have been extremely successful in positioning gas as pro-development, as pro-energy security, as pro-climate. And part of the reason for this success is that it talks to our legitimate desires on the continent to address our energy security needs, to unlock economic development. But I think, let's be honest, oil and gas companies don't act for altruistic purposes. So it really is imperative that we have the space as South Africans, as Mozambicans, as Senegalese, to interrogate these promises and to make informed decisions based on robust evidence about all of our options. I think, unfortunately, the polarization of the debates in South Africa and elsewhere is simply limiting this space and is impacting our decision-making process. The second point I want to make, and this is looking to the global context, is that in making the decisions that we're making today about our energy future, we need to be informed by global trends. And I don't just mean the technology trends or the price trends, but also the geopolitical shifts that we're seeing. I think it's very clear that global powers are in a race to capture the future green markets. This is evident from the greening of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, the EU Green Deal, Biden's Build Back Better. So how are we as South Africa or Senegal, as Mozambique, thinking about capturing these future markets? And how are we positioning ourselves to have a share of this future market so that we avoid simply becoming receivers of technologies produced elsewhere? And how are we thinking about mitigating the risk that policies like the carbon border adjustment mechanisms will have on the competitiveness of our goods? So I think it's absolutely clear, not only in South Africa, but elsewhere on the continent, the time is of the essence. We're looking to make significant investments from our limited budgets in choices that may not serve either our current or our future needs. So robust evidence like the report produced by the IISD is absolutely critical. And I really want to commend the team for the important contribution that they've made. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellen, for those fantastic perspectives. It's great to think about the current debate, both in terms of Africa and the global perspective. I'll now ask my colleague Richard Halsey to share findings from IISD's report on exploring the case for gas-fired power in South Africa. Richard is a policy advisor with IISD South Africa program, and his work focuses on just transition, system transformation, and sustainable solutions to energy in South Africa. He's also the lead author on this report. Richard, can I ask you to share your screen and present your slides?
Yes, hello everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Let me just share the screen and okay. Are you guys seeing the presentation?
Perfect, that's great. Yes.
Okay, great. So my plan is to go through this quite quickly in about 15 minutes. The report obviously has a lot more information, so not all of it's included here. And this presentation is a summary of our recent report, which is available online as of today. So the first thing is, why are we looking at gas-fired power in South Africa? And there's two reasons we thought this was important. The first one is this idea of it being an anchor tenant for the gas industry. Now, if you look at the consultation document for the gas master plan, there's a sort of conundrum, you know, without demand, it's difficult to develop supply, and without supply, it's difficult to develop demand. And the position there was one way of breaking this impasse is to create significant anchor gas demand through the development of a gas to power program. Now, our view, and it's just an opinion, is that in some ways this is putting the proverbial cart before the horse. So we are saying that we should first objectively analyze the merits of gas to power versus alternatives that can fulfill the same function, and that gas to power should not be used to catalyze development in the broader gas industry if it is not the best solution for the power sector. And the second one is in terms of South Africa's ambition in terms of gas to power. From the integrated resource plan, there's 3,000 megawatts. But if you have a look at all the proposed projects that have either been granted environmental authorization or we're trying to get that in 2021, it's about 14,000 megawatts. So clearly there is a large appetite for new gas-fired power, and given the sort of state of development of other technologies, is this the best decision for the country now? So the introduction is just some very basic concepts, which we'll be talking about. What types of gas turbines do you have? You have open cycle gas turbines, which are a simple combustion process where the heat is lost and they have a rapid response, whereas combined cycle gas turbines are a more complex process where you recover the heat, but their ramping up and down times are slower. Now, really important for this debate, many of you may know, but some people get confused, is that gas turbines, despite their name, can run on liquid fuels, and that's how Eskom's peaking plants currently run. And just in terms for the way we discuss this in this report, there's functional categories for utility scale facilities. What we've said, bulk supply is where you get the majority of electricity from. And if you were to use gas, that would be CCGTs. Peaking, we have defined as your daily peaks. So that's very short periods, sort of morning, afternoon peak, and that's typically OCGTs. And what we've called balancing and backup is something where it's for longer periods than peaking. Okay, now if we have a very quick look at the status quo, because we need to look at what we've got first in South Africa before we decide what to do next. Now, the first one is that gas is not yet used for utility scale electricity generation. The second one is that our supply is mainly from Mozambique, but future options haven't been finalized. The third point is that if we were to import LNG at large scale, we don't yet have those facilities. We need to build them. The fourth one is that a lot of gas-related plans and policies are still under development. So there is no integrated energy plan, and there's not yet a gas master plan. And the fifth one, which is really important, is that gas is often promoted as a way to complement renewable energy. But at the moment, renewable energy is only 5%. So, you know, we need to be thinking about when this need to complement renewables really kicks in. And the last point on this is that there seems to be a push to use gas plants at a high level. Now, from the risk mitigation program, the rules were such that Eskom would need to pay for a minimum of 50% of net available capacity for a 20-year period. And this, as we'll see later, is very different from a modeling outcome where you just use them as a reserve. So I'm going to quickly whip through some risks that we have identified, not in detail. But the first one is that gas to power, the value chain contributes to climate change. So methane is about 85 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. So when you look at the gas to power value chain, the methane leakage should be included, but most analysis does not do that. Some organizations that have looked at it have concluded that the electricity produced from gas could have comparable or potentially worse greenhouse gas emissions than compared to coal on a 20-year basis. The second one is international pressure to move away from gas. Now, there's all sorts of examples. Some countries have banned exploration and extraction. Many of us are familiar with the IEA saying we can't invest more. There's coalitions like the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance that are committed to phasing out gas, and multilateral agreements like the Methane Pledge at COP26. Just by way of example, here are some members that have committed to gas phase out. Then most of these risks that I've already mentioned are related to the climate, and they translate to financial risks. And very briefly, some of them are countries pledging to end public finance. Some banks are already pulling out of financing gas projects. Cost of capital is increasing. There's a carbon tax, divestment, and carbon border adjustment mechanism. Each one in its own might not do too much, but in combination, they are starting to have an effect. And just a very brief look at this graph, you see the blue line is how the cost of capital for LNG has increased, whereas most of the renewables are decreasing. So a fourth point is, and this is for South Africa, is do we have affordable and reliable gas supply? Well, domestic supply is uncertain. There might be these discoveries like Brulpadda, but nothing has actually been confirmed with what will happen with those. In terms of piped gas, once the current reserves in Mozambique run out, you'd need to build more pipelines. That is still to be determined. And when you import LNG, it comes with a price volatility risk. It might go up, it might go down, but you can't predict ahead what it will be. Then quickly on stranded gas assets. A stranded asset is something that is, had a premature write-down, devaluation, or conversion to liabilities, and that means you can't recover your investments. Now, to give a practical example of where this has happened in India, 60% of their gas capacity, which is about 14 gigawatts, or the same sort of amount that's potentially on the cards in South Africa, was already declared as stranded in 2015. In 2019, the State Bank of India said they'd have to write these off, and many of these plants were stranded within 5 years of being commissioned. Now, from a financial perspective, 5 years is not the lifespan you're hoping for. And the amounts of money potentially involved, as we can see from this newspaper headline, are pretty large. And in South Africa, who would bear the costs of these stranded assets? So quickly, the last point is just transition burden. Almost by definition, the gas to power would be a short-lived industry if it's a transition fuel. So essentially that could create a situation where a future generation of gas workers face similar problems to what's faced in the coal sector now. Okay, so to quickly go through the next bit, and I say I'm going through this fast, is how are the alternatives to gas? Now, levelized cost of energy analysis, if we look for bulk supply, we know that renewables are cheaper if you compare those values. If you look at peaking supply, batteries and pumped storage are cheaper than open cycle gas turbines. And if we look a little bit more at peaking, what really revolutionized the energy sector was the drop in renewables, but the rate at which storage is dropping is even faster. And this kind of disruption meant that even in 2021, the combination of utility scale PV plus storage was also less than gas peaking plants. And this is the disruption we are talking about. Then if we look at the balancing and backup, which is for longer term, the first point is that you don't necessarily have to build new facilities. The report has this graph that there's a whole number of other measures you can use to integrate renewables into the grid before you actually need to build new generation facilities. Then the next one is there could be a direct replacement for natural gas. Many of us are familiar with green hydrogen. And from the Hydrogen Society roadmap, they're already suggesting that the IRP should include hydrogen generation starting from 2025. That might use a different type of hydrogen than green hydrogen. And green hydrogen is not yet cost competitive, but it is improving. And these are just some examples from the States. They are already converting natural gas plants to hydrogen. So the question in this case is, look, if other countries are already switching over, if we haven't even built any yet, is there the option to leapfrog? So the next one is about, do we need gas supply? And there's two points I'd like to bring up here. The first is this study from 2016, which evaluated how good are our renewable resources. And the important outcome of that is that across the entire country, if you optimally distribute renewables, a 20 to 30% share can provide a smooth output with minimum short-term fluctuations, which means that until you get to a reasonably high share of renewables, your balancing needs are fairly minimal. And this was work by Meridian Economics in 2020. And their analysis was that your existing and some new OCGTs run within the historical OCGT liquid fuel range can provide all your balancing and peaking requirements in all scenarios for the next 15 years. So in an optimized system, you are running these OCGTs very infrequently. They function as reserve capacity, so your fuel use is very low. So we're not saying that the plan is to run the country on open cycle gas turbines, but that if you optimally design the system, they run at very low levels and you can get by with liquid fuels for the next 15 years. The advantages of this is you could avoid locking in another new fossil fuel to the power sector. So if we summarize sort of the arguments that I've been talking about, and the report goes into more detail, if we ask the question, is there an economic case for gas turbines? Now, remember, in this case, they could run on gas or liquid fuel. We say there isn't for bulk and peaking, but for balancing and backup, they are becoming increasingly uneconomic due to the risks with gas, renewables integration techniques, and both improvements in storage and other flexible dispatchable generators. If we now look at, is there a technical need for new gas turbines, not for bulk supply? And similarly to the economic case, because the capabilities of storage, renewables integration techniques are improving, the need for gas turbines should be decreasing. And then the final question is there a technical need at the moment for new gas supply? And our stance on this is, well, not prior to 2035, because as per the Meridian work, if necessary, liquid fuels can cover those needs. And post 2035, we're looking at the kind of time frame where green hydrogen should be cost competitive. So the second last section I'll deal with is what should we be doing? And our conclusion is focus on short-term priorities and knowledge gaps. In terms of models to 2050, our stance is you don't need to solve the details of 2050 now. I mean, all the work around renewables predictions, 20 years ago was so far off that if we think we can do that now, we're likely to be wrong. So we need to have principles in mind and where we're going, but we don't need to work out the details. What do we need to do in the short term? But before we get to the short term, if we think about 2050, this is where the big debate is. Some plans build gas turbines, others don't. So the thing to remember is that in the optimized realistic models that do build gas turbines, they are to provide backup for long lull periods in renewables where other storage facilities can't provide that function. But this happens very rarely. So fuel use is low as per the earlier slide. Where gas is not built at all, it's only renewables and storage. And I'm sure this will come up in the panel discussion. And the big advantage here is that an overbuild of renewables capacity can provide surplus electricity or superpower at near zero marginal cost, which comes with a whole lot of other potential benefits. And we're in a situation where some people think you can go one way and some people think you can go another. So what does that leave us to do in terms of short-term plans to 2030? We say take the low-risk option, focus on implementing what has evidence-based consensus and what is the most future-proof. Also, we need to address knowledge gaps because this technology disruption, particularly around energy storage, has been so fast, then even some of the modeling outputs from 2019 are already outdated. So what this leaves us with is short-term priorities. We absolutely have to significantly increase the rate at which renewables are added. All of these plans fall apart if you don't add enough renewables, and you need to add storage at a rate that is aligned with that. And our two main recommendations with gas is, as per my cart before the horse scenario, don't use the power sector as a reason to develop broader gas demand. Revisit this in sort of 8 or so years when we've seen how other technologies has developed. And in terms of gas turbines, this is where there is a knowledge gap of, with this disruptive change, do we still need to build any new turbines in the short term, whether they run on liquid fuels or gas? And this is an area that should be looked into. So very briefly, conclusions is there could be potential negative outcomes if we invest a lot of money in gas to power now. Very briefly, some of them are they take up part of the carbon budget. If assets are stranded, government might have to bail them out. And investments in gas could crowd out other technologies. For every 1,000 megawatts of one technology you invest in, it might be 1,000 megawatts that you don't in another. Also, particularly if gas is run at a high capacity factor, it could have an effect on electricity prices. And the severity of these is related to the extent of the investment. The next one is a repeat of what I said earlier about the short-term priorities. So significantly increase renewables, energy efficiency, as per that graph of other ways you can integrate renewables and your storage. Third one is around planning. You know, we need a collaborative and transparent update of the integrated resource plan. We also think that if you have all these excellent groups doing so much work on energy, why can't they be combined into the work the department is doing to produce a new IRP? And we should also look at ways to factor in the risks that I've mentioned. And as per before, we really need an integrated energy plan as well. And the very last one is our suggestion, and it's just our opinion, is to pause development of the gas to power sector. We can revisit the supply portion of this in around 2030. This idea of building a huge fleet of combined cycle gas turbines, particularly if they are planned to be run at high capacities and required, and that we need to fully investigate the short-term need for any new OCGTs given the changes that have occurred. And that is it from me for now.
Thanks, Richard. It's great how you asked so many questions and made my job really easy. So I'll just happily pass on to the panel discussion now. Please, Richard, can you just keep an eye out for some questions for you that are coming in the Q&A box? It'll be great if you can answer them, but if you want to reserve some for the very end, then let us know, we can make time for that as well. Moving to our panel discussion now, we are privileged to have 3 experts with us, and we'll break this panel discussion into 2 parts. So let's start with part 1. Where each of the panelists will have a maximum of 3 minutes to share their comments. And their comments can range from responding to the report or sharing their own research, which is relevant to today's discussion. So let me first introduce our first panelist, Clyde Mallinson. Clyde is the Director of Virtual Energy and Power. He's a solutions-driven energy analyst with a special interest in utility-scale energy storage systems and their role in the electricity supply system. Clyde is an appointed energy and alternative energy advisor to the Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure. And he's currently supporting a number of district municipalities on the idea of district-led bulk supply of electricity. So Clyde, many thanks for joining us today, and over to you for the next 3 minutes on any thoughts on today's debate.
Thanks very much, Shruti, and great to be here with you on this launch of your report. So I'm going to use my opening statement to just indicate a glimpse of the future electricity supply industry. So it's going to start off with a slight critique of the report, as well as a critique of all reports currently. And all of them haven't quite yet factored in that the demand profiles of the future are going to change significantly to what they are today. So we tend to take our current demand profile and say, oh, we've got a peak in the evening, and we scale it up to 2050, and the peak in the evening gets even bigger because we move to a less energy intensive economy, and therefore we have to address that. Well, I've got news for everyone. Very soon, our peak demand is going to be at midday. And that's simply because we will be charging our batteries at midday. And when a battery is charging, it becomes part of the demand. So in the very near future, our peak is going to be at midday, whereas at present, our peak is at 7 o'clock in the afternoon. And so the whole demand profile is going to change, and it's actually going to be, currently we have a demand profile and we're desperately trying to plug the gaps. We're saying we're going to fill this with this, we're going to have a shortage here, let's get peaking plants to, we're plugging the gaps and we're dancing to the tune of the demand profile. In the future, the generation profile will set the tune, and we will adapt our demand offtake to the generation profile. And so it's going to turn the industry on its head. And a last point to drive this home, at the moment, we tend to fill our pump storage at night when we have a surplus. If we have a surplus, sometimes we have load shedding to create that surplus to be able to charge them at night. And we discharge during the day, mainly at peak periods. Well, in the future, we're going to be charging our storage facilities in the middle of the day, and we're going to be discharging them mainly at night. So it's going to turn the whole thing on its head, 180, or let's rather say 12 hours, then 180 degrees. So that's my opening point, is that we need to understand the disruptive fundamental change that's taking place and the impact that has on the future, and that we can't use any forms of current projections into the future. We need to project back from the future to today to understand where we're heading. Thank you.
Thanks, Clyde. That's great. I'm going to have some more questions for you towards the end, but just to be fair, I'll move on to the next panelist. Our next panelist is Peter Attard-Montalto. He is the head of capital markets research at Intellidex. Peter brings in 16 years of experience on South Africa's economy, politics, policy, and markets. Peter was previously head of emerging Europe, Middle East, and Africa economics at Japanese bank Nomura, and he is an expert in the political economy of reform and infrastructure. He's currently an advisor to a large number of financiers, investors, and bidders in energy and infrastructure in South Africa. Peter, thank you so much for being here today, and I look forward to listening to your thoughts.
Thanks very much, Shruti, and great to be here. So at Intellidex, we are dealing with the gas question as quite a live issue with banks, with portfolio investors in South Africa, offshore investors looking at investing in South Africa as well. This is really very much a live issue, and so the report is certainly very well timed. And I would sort of pick up on what Richard said about needing a sort of evidence-based consensus. There is actually a lot of contestation in this issue, I think, as we will see in the Q&A and the panel discussion later. And there has been an attempt, maybe, or an oversimplicity at times in the media and elsewhere to grab the first report that comes out. We saw that with the NBI report that came out recently, which had some issues around modeling and the outputs that it came up with. So I think this is a great addition, certainly, to the debate. I think what I certainly like about the report is this idea of closing windows, basically, of opportunity. And I think that's really been the focus of discussion for us dealing with bankability issues, with credit committees in banks and with portfolio investors, is this idea that you're dealing with quite a long window in an investment, and the world's going to look very, very different at the end of a 20-year investment timeframe than it does now. And the window certainly is now. There's both contestation and policy development going on, of course, in the gas area, but it will look very different in the future. And we see that, of course, from the EU carbon border adjustment that was mentioned earlier by Ellen. We see that as well from the pressure from stakeholders, shareholders of banks in particular, and the greater transparency from reporting coming through as well. But I think really this issue of stranded assets, which the report picks up on, and it puts the estimate of 185 to 270 billion on stranded assets, should I think focus the minds in this debate. It's an issue the SARB has started discussing a lot with banks in South Africa, but this sort of issue has been at sea somewhat because there isn't this sort of evidence-based consensus that we're looking for on these issues. But I think it's the key sort of quantum, both of direct gas to power in and of itself, and of course the wider gas infrastructure as well, which makes gas slightly different from other fuel technologies and from renewables in particular for banks thinking about funding in this area. I think the real challenge, though, for funders, for investors, is around basically the fact that policy is likely to go in the direction of gas, or attempt to go in the direction of gas, I should say. Eskom is talking obviously about the need for maybe 20% gas in a heavily renewable energy dominated system. We're going to have a gas master plan that's in the process. We're going to have some form of new IRP eventually, but we're stuck at the moment in the sort of status quo dynamic of the existing IRP. And I think we need someone to sort of lift us out of that, if you like. And I think that's where we're watching the Presidential Climate Commission very closely this year. They're going to be saying a lot on the energy mix going forwards. I think someone, an institution with credibility like that, is going to dictate a lot the direction that funding takes and the views on stranded assets and things like that. But we also need to consider, right, we're not going to be in this idealized system maybe that is sometimes laid out. We probably are going to see delays to further bid windows of REAP. We've seen delays to private wheeled and self-generation coming through as well. And so we're going to be in an environment, I think, that is, from a policy and a political economy perspective, is when you add in the Russia-Ukraine war as well, it's going to be quite ripe for pushing a gas view. And I think all that ends up in more legal contestation in particular. And we're expecting, I think, a lot more legal action, both against process and against outcomes in particular. But I think just to wrap up some thoughts on the funding side that come out of the report really is this idea that funders need to think very, very carefully about closing windows and the pace at which these windows close, which the report lays out at the start. We need more transparency, I think, to the views of some policymakers, particularly the SARB and National Treasury. We get the publication of the taxonomy tomorrow coming out, but we need a lot more transparency on the views of policymakers on some of these issues. I think that really will dictate the backdrop and the environment within which gas to power can or can't happen and to the scale that it does. Thanks very much.
That makes a lot of sense. I think you've ended on the right note on data transparency. Definitely helps us to ask the right questions then when we see that information. Thanks, Peter. Our final panelist is Crescent Mushwana. He is a principal engineer at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. In his current role, he focuses on the Energy Systems Research Group under the CSIR Energy Center, and he has over 19 years of experience in the power industry, covering substation design, power equipment specialization, and power system planning, with most of his experience gained at Eskom. Before joining the CSIR, he was chief engineer in the Eskom grid planning. Therefore, his core expertise is in the energy system planning and analysis. Crescent, thank you so much for joining us today. May I please hand over to you for your comments?
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for joining the session. And yeah, I think it was quite interesting in terms of the presentation that's been given around gas, what the focus should be in South Africa. And my view would be to, when currently, of course, with the current IRP, is just like 10 years, like up to 2030, which is not an ideal period for a long-term plan for a country to be planning on any technology as a start. But of course, in terms of investment, what needs to go into different areas, at least it gives a guidance in terms of providing some certainty around that. But in terms of looking at the long term, what we need to do as a country, my feeling is the current IRP, of course, we all agree that it needs to be revised, as the report also highlights. And also that there's a need to make sure that we link the IRP with the IEP, which is supposed to be like an overall, like an overarching document in terms of the energy future for the country. So, and I think, well, what the report highlights in terms of the issues around gas being the focus area, in terms of gas to power for the country, I think, of course, there are risks there, which of course, cannot be fully assessed until we have really looked at what the new IRP would look like in terms of its long-term energy mix that is proposed in the IRP. And additional to that, of course, we understand that gas currently, we have it in South Africa in terms of the existing gas plants, which of course are run on diesel. And of course, we've seen in the media of Eskom's appetite to to convert them to LNG from OCGT to CCGTs, which of course, I mean, in the short term, I think will actually be able to fill that gap in terms of what we need to do in the country. But unfortunately, in terms of what we need to do in the long term, that concern for me is still there. And once we have the new IRP and also the IEP linked to that, we'll have like a better certainty. And one thing for me, which I think it's a bit of a problem now, we're looking at gas master plan for the country, which is great. And currently it does not even have approved long-term IRP to be linked to, neither does it have an IEP. So there are these plans which are done, well, I would say somewhat in silos, and they're supposed to be very much integrated. And so I think that integrated approach in terms of what we need to do in terms of gas in the country, either gas for the industry or gas to power, I think we can't look at those two topics separately. We have to make sure we've got an integrated approach. And of course, I understand the concern of the industry looking at gas to power as an anchor to drive the gas industry in the country, which of course currently they can easily do because we don't have a proper plan which shows which aspect should lead which one. So and then lastly, in terms of the technologies that are available in terms of providing the flexibility that the power system needs, I fully agree that we have other technologies or alternatives that can be brought to bear to address the flexibility issue in terms of balancing of the power system. And those technologies, of course, everything about power system planning at the end of the day is about the cost. And of course, the use of the technologies and all those aspects. If we've got a long-term plan, which of course goes beyond 2030, my feeling is we'll have a much more broader understanding of what the risk is around stranded assets and also what the price volatility risk is for the end consumer in terms of the price of electricity. Because at the end of the day, it's the price of electricity that the consumer will need to pay, either we can or cannot afford it, and what the risks are around that. So those aspects, I think they are still hanging at some level. And I think this document opens a discussion, which of course, others might have different views, but I think it opens a discussion which is critical to push us in the right direction in terms of what we need to do in an integrated approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. That was wonderfully put. I liked how you talked about what we're doing in the short term versus what the long-term ambition is, and both are not sort of well coordinated. I have many follow-up questions, but I've got my eye on the time, and I want to make sure we have enough time for all our participants for the Q&A at the end. So I'll swiftly move on to part 2 of our panel discussion. And I, as the moderator, have the privilege to sort of kick off some questions to our panelists. So there are no strict rules on this, except I'll request our panelists to please limit their answers to 2 minutes. I'll open with a question, and any of the panelists can sort of volunteer to go first. So my first question is on just transition. So globally, we have this concept of natural gas being labeled as a transition fuel. But is that concept still valid given rapidly falling costs of renewables and energy storages that Richard and some of you also spoke about, along with the emergence of all this new tech on green hydrogen? So can't South Africa sort of leapfrog natural gas? And I think Richard also asked this question, or is it very essential to adjust energy transition as is often presented by the government? So that's a question. If any of our panelists want to go first, otherwise I can use some nudge theory. And maybe ask Present if he wants to go first. Hi, Present. If you can hear me, do you want to take this question?
I can start, but I'm sure my other colleagues will have like better views around that. I think, of course, I mean, the transition of the power sector, of course, is a given. That's happening. And even in South Africa, we know no one can deny that we're moving into a future with high wind and solar into the power system. And with that, of course, as a power system planners, we speak of flexibility, which of course in the report, it's simplified as looking at balancing and backup. And with high shares of wind and solar in the power system, that is a given, we'll need that. So the issue there is the technologies and the long-term cost trajectory of the different technologies that will be able to provide that balancing. In the short term, historically, of course, we've looked at gas as a transition fuel to provide the flexibility to the power system. But I think going to the future, of course, I do see a role for gas in the short term. If we move quickly in terms of renewables and the other technologies in terms of large-scale battery storage, maybe they don't drop as fast as we would expect. And then another thing, even about gas, I think there are other benefits that, of course, we'll have to assess going to the future in terms of gas being able to provide that rotational inertia to the power system, which is critical for the power system stability. And those type of aspects will need to be weighed against the other technologies and what they'll be able to provide in terms of providing the stability to the power system and the flexibility. So I think that question in my mind, that question definitely still has to be asked now, if ever gas is still the preferred transition fuel to provide us system stability. And all of this must be done in the context of a long-term energy system future that we're looking at. Because in the interim, like in the short term, definitely will assist, but there is that risk of stranded assets that has been mentioned. And I think that's the real risk which we can fully assess if we can really look longer into the future. Thank you.
Right, I saw you.
Sorry, that's I go. Yeah, I think the simple thing is that people don't know what it means. People don't know what transition fuel means, right? And I think that's where watching how actually a consensus is formed on what the just energy transition is-ish, we're not quite there yet, but the involvement of public debate and a conversation around that since 2019, when no one knew what that term meant, I think, has been very instructive. And that's where I think it's important that we get to some kind of consensus on what the just energy or what a transition fuel really means. But I think the wider context is still important, which is that on the natural gas question, it feels like we are trying to squidge excuses for natural gas into a gas master plan, because there is this endowmentist view still that there is a lot of gas offshore and from fracking potentially onshore. And I think that is still an odd view, basically, and the two things can be viewed separately. I think South Africa can do, in terms of its domestic power system, all its own modeling and views and optimization to come to the right least carbon output or outcome on a path towards 2050. But the export question and producing natural gas for export to other countries in the world who have their own transition paths, I think is a quite separate issue. And if companies want to take the risk and have the financing to do offshore gas, etc., they should do. And I think South Africa probably should allow them to, and then put in place an appropriate regime of tax, etc. But the interesting thing about this whole gas question is actually how I think DMRE is not actually following through on what it wants to create in terms of supportive environment for gas. We've seen, the Upstream Petroleum Resource Development Bill stalled in Parliament now for some time, and the regulatory regime that's required to actually allow offshore gas and onshore gas exploration to happen, it isn't coming into place. And I think this is, again, this issue of closing windows. If you are to properly have this domestic endowmentist view of gas, the DMRE is not going about it in the right way before these windows actually close. And I think that needs to be borne in mind as well. But no, I don't think most people in finance, in banking, really know what a transition fuel actually is. I think that's why we need an update of IRP. That's why we need a credible view on what the number is. I think it comes down to a number, right? Amount of gigawatts of gas that you actually need. But I know Clyde has lots of views on that.
Clyde, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks. So I would break this question down into the one is just the transition, and from my opinion, we don't need gas in the power section as a transition fuel. It's a red herring, as it were. When it comes to a just transition, the discussion is much greater. And my thoughts on a just transition, normally one focuses on job losses in the coal sector in Mpumalanga. And I think Richard in his intro said, if we now have a sort of acknowledged short-term gas sort of program, then we're going to have another just transition required to get those gas guys weaned off of the gas bottle and onto something else. And so we prolonging the actual just transition. I prefer the term just transformation. And I think that in the energy sector in South Africa, the opportunity is just screaming out of us to look at a transformation of the whole socio-economic construct of South Africa. We have an opportunity to shrink the world's largest Gini coefficient. We have an opportunity for citizen ownership of the new renewable fleet. We have an opportunity of using surplus low-cost renewable energy to produce products that can be sent to keep people in Europe warm in winter, so that they're not dependent on gas imports from Russia. We should be looking at export opportunities of our ability to generate low-cost renewable energy in South Africa, but we should do that in the context at the same time of having a parallel stream of low-cost renewable electricity for South Africans. Imagine if we say we can produce low-cost green hydrogen to keep guys in Europe warm in winter, but at the same time, we're paying 5 times the cost for high-cost gas-derived electricity in South Africa. That's not going to go down particularly well. So the things need to be integrated. We can't have what I like to term as a bifurcation in the price of energy. We can't be looking at increasing energy costs for local consumption at the same time as bragging about low-cost green hydrogen exports to keep Peter warm in the UK in the winter. And so the just transformation, I believe at its core, needs to seek methods of enabling citizen ownership of this new fleet, such that they derive coupon dividends from it within the local financing structures. And if we are going to utilize concessional funding from wherever, that concessional funding should be used to underwrite collateral for out-of-work South Africans to be able to acquire a portion of this new fleet and generate an income from it. So that's my take on just transition. As a transition fuel, we don't need it. And it will play no real role in a just transition, even if we did need it. Thanks.
Very clear on that, Shai. Thank you. So my next question is a little bit on the politics of gas. So is the current push for gas-fired power, particularly large combined cycle gas turbines, is it a distraction from where current focus should be in terms of addressing a constrained power system and ending load shedding? And Peter, can I start with you on this question? I know you spoke a little bit about it and you hinted a bit on the politics of it in your previous reply, but can I just ask you to elaborate a little bit more on this?
So I think there's a current sort of mania around the sort of political economy of gas, particularly in the midst of the Russia-Ukraine war. There's been a lot of sort of hyperbolic media coverage of potentially what the drivers are behind the scenes on these sorts of things. But I think when we strip it all back, Clyde talked about the sort of the social side of the transition, but we actually also have a very large political economy transition that has to happen as well. Which part of it is clean, quote unquote, and part of it is a lot of vested interests, right? And I think we have to remember there's a huge volume of funds that come currently from the coal and coal ecosystem status quo that funds the political economy within South Africa. And I think the importance of gas as large set piece in investment as a result becomes very interesting within the political economy. I think that's unfortunate, right? And I think that's something the gas sector has to manage head on very, very, very carefully. But I think there are basically some ulterior motives for what is going on, and we need to consider that. I think that's why we and part of why we're seeing such a strong push into gas, and we need to, as a result, keep very skeptical eye on, I think, things like a gas master plan, on how a new IRP, say, is constructed, some of the constraints that are potentially put in place on the back of it. But I think there are other ideological things to come to play as well, in particular the endowmentist view that I mentioned earlier, which is this love affair, that stuff that's in the ground that can be turned into power, but also into tax, into jobs, etc., is kind of the only way of going about it. And of course, it ignores the fact that South Africa has some other forms of endowment, such as solar intensity and things like that, which are a form of endowment to be plundered in a good way as well. I think we get and some in the debate attempt to take this very narrow view of what endowment really means. But no, I think the politics of it overall are incredibly important in all this. But actually, I think we've seen surprises in this debate. So I mean, I think if 2-3 years ago we said, talking about liberalization of the energy sector, we would say the unions were completely set against this and would completely say no. And actually what we saw in the debate in the run-up to last year's liberalization of Schedule 2 of the ERA was actually the unions came on board. And I think there are surprises in this transition. I think as you lay out the evidence on jobs, etc., they start to become more obvious. And there are pathways through the political economy on this. The big missing pathway at the moment, really, on the renewable side, I think, which maybe the gas side makes slightly better, is the broader sort of industrialization picture. And I think we are in a slight sort of circular chicken and egg problem of industrialization at the moment. And when you start adding that in, a lot of the sort of jobs, etc., the wider social transition, I think, becomes a lot of an easier sell. But no, I think the political economy drivers here are incredibly important.
I've just got my eye on the time, and I sort of quickly want to just go through my last slightly provocative question, but it's something where Richard ended his slide on. I was just putting on hold the whole gas to power development and monitoring sort of how alternatives are progressing. So maybe Clyde and Chris, if I can just come to you on this question, because both of you brought up this point on consumer prices and what consumers in South Africa will pay for power, and that should be affordable to them. So what are the risks if we put this gas to power plan on hold right now and you monitor how alternatives are progressing? These alternatives, like Richard mentioned in his slides, could be green hydrogen storage. So just what are the risks and what are the techno-economic changes that need to occur to support such a decision? And along with any thoughts on like timelines for this?
Thanks. The techno-economic changes that need to occur have occurred already. They're just becoming more compelling. As we sit debating it, they become more compelling by the second, basically. So there's nothing that needs to happen techno-economically that hasn't already happened. It's just getting better. That's the first point. The second point is, yes, we can certainly place any need for gas to power on hold, because these dropping off of gas needs for gas to liquids and for gas in industrial uses. So if we did get a little bit of extra gas, it'll find a home anywhere. There's no need to create a whole new home in the gas to power sector. So techno-economically, it's not a problem anymore. The problem at the moment is one of logistics. We've wasted 6 years of getting a crack on. And I worry now that the scale of what we need to build wind, solar, and storage, whether we're up to it. We've seen construction companies fall over. We've seen our ports not operating as well as they should. We've seen the rail system deteriorate. I don't want to paint a bleak picture, but the bottom line is now it's one about logistics. The debate as to what we should do, in my opinion, is more or less over, because it doesn't preclude doing small nuclear reactors in the future. It doesn't preclude looking at gas post 2030. What we need to do now is have a Marshall Plan where we're treating our energy shortage at the moment as the crisis that it is, and we are marshalling all resources to open up the logistic chains and see what is actually possible to do. And it's interesting in that context to look at countries like Vietnam, perhaps. If I've got my numbers correctly, Vietnam installed 11 gigawatts of solar on rooftops in 1 year. And yet we're saying, gee, will we be able to put in 2 gigawatts in the whole country in 1 year? Never mind on rooftops plus utility scale. So to my mind, the techno-economic challenges have been met and are just improving. And it's now down to political leadership and will and logistics. And those logistics, I've mentioned it before, could even include massive public works programs to roll out the required build that we need. At the same time as solving many of the other issues that are wrapped up in what is known as a wicked problem. So instead of just trying to solve load shedding, we say, what about the truck drivers driving coal? And you say, well, you give them the option. Would you rather go round and round in circles, spending half your time waiting in a queue, delivering coal, or would you rather deliver solar panels from the harbor to the areas where the plants are being built? So we're going to need lots and lots of truck drivers to be delivering solar panels in future. And I know which one of those two I would prefer. I can't think of anything worse than sitting in a queue at Majuba coal-fired power station for 3 hours in the hot sun with the bad air quality, waiting to unload my coal truck. But yeah, so we don't need new techno-economic breakthroughs. We just need to leverage the rate and understand the rate and scale at which those breakthroughs continue to improve on economies of scale. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Clyde. That was really clear on the question. We've got several questions now, and I think we're moving into the last part in the Q&A. So maybe let me just invite my colleague Richard Halsey to kick off and answer some of the questions that were asked to him, and maybe respond on a few other comments that were raised, and then maybe we'll move on from there. Richard, do you want to come in?
Yep. Thanks very much to everyone for their contributions. There's a whole lot of questions, so I'm trying to work out which one would be most appropriate. So perhaps what would be good is we have sort of half an hour left, and we can obviously pass potentially some questions to or take some questions and verbal inputs from anyone who's attending. So if you do want to do that, please raise your hand. And I mean, just sort of as an overall comment, we fully realize that this is a highly contested issue and that there are lots of different pros and cons. And our objective here was just to add to the debate only in the power sector. So what we also have to realize is that gas has a much bigger role potentially in the broader economy. What does industry do with it? Potentially for transport and all sorts of other things. So just so that people are fully aware that our report is specifically only looking at the power sector. And as I'd said earlier, the reason we did that is because this is where there seems to be a lot of activity and a big rush to kind of jump in. And if we break our sort of thinking down into the simplest form, it's that it does appear, at least to us, that the risks associated with gas to power are increasing, and both the capabilities and the costs of alternatives are decreasing. And if it is that because of such a low percentage of renewables in the power system now, we have a bit of time to wait and see how other technologies develop, then from a sort of flexible planning in a disruptive scenario, that is an advantageous position. And obviously we can see, and I think Peter and others have alluded to this, that on the other side of the coin, there may be people in industry who also view this closing window as a reason to get in as soon as possible. And that is why this is a contested area. And we just hope that some of the content of the report can get people to think around, South Africa's the economy is not in a position to make big, expensive mistakes. You know, other countries with a robust economy can experiment a bit more with things, you know, post-COVID, and that we do need to be careful, and particularly around stranded assets, as has been mentioned. I think that's all I'd like to add for now, but hopefully we can hand over to others who would like to chip in.
If no one else wants to come in, maybe we can take some questions from participants. Peter, can I come to you to answer some questions from Nick and from Craig Morrell? They're asking about, apart from the gas industry bodies, if others, oh, sorry about that. Maybe if you can see the questions in the chat box. I seem to have lost it scrolling up and down.
Yeah, there are some interesting questions from Nick and Craig in the chat. I think that the first interesting one is this alternative role of gas as a lower emitter, and I think that's why we need new IRP, and why the new construction of IRP that is done underneath the carbon envelope that moves towards net zero is so important. And we can then stress test these issues of alternatives in emissions versus price, etc., through an actual sort of evidence-based technocratic framework. And I think that's really how those sorts of issues have to be dealt with, and why we need to deal with those with credibility. In terms of Craig's question, I think Nick touches on this as well, around dual fuel capacities in gas and how you deal with the stranded asset problem. I think there has not been enough discussion yet from either the gas industry in project terms, or from the banking sector and from others, about actually ensuring that we deal with this stranded asset risk, and how you can ensure dual fuel capability on pipelines, etc. I think that there's a massive hole of knowledge and of focus actually on that, and I think that would serve all participants in this very well to think more on that. And it's one of those issues I think that credit committees and others, the portfolio investors, will be looking at very closely indeed in the future. I think the way that projects really are looked at by funders is going to change quite a lot. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now.
Clyde, there's a question on understanding the risks from the new technologies that we spoke about, and if they've been studied really well, and if we know the answers on the supply chain, manufacturing, jurisdiction, etc. Do you want to take that question?
Yes, thanks very much. I think it comes from Daryl, and it's a pressing question at the moment. We're all aware of the massive increases in oil and gas prices, but we're also possibly well aware of the massive increases in the cost of lithium and nickel and various ingredients that go into many battery energy storage systems. And so it's a very significant and pressing problem. The good news there is that the price of storage, with all of those sort of fivefold increases in many of the ingredients, has only resulted, and I say only, resulted in approximately a 30% increase on the cost of the storage. And so one realizes that a lot of those very expensive elements only make up quite small percentages of the cost of storage. But I want to touch on two amazing endowments that South Africa has with regard to storage. The one is that our old gold mines, and even some of the existing ones, can be used as underground pumped hydro facilities. So instead of building a whole new hydro pump storage dam, we can actually use old gold mines. We basically use the upper levels for the upper pump storage and the lower levels for lower pump storage. And we put a pipe in between the upper and the lower level, and we run turbines. And they're talking about doing that in the Netherlands. And I think the Netherlands is also sometimes known as the Low Countries. They've got no topography changes there. So they're talking about making holes underground in the Netherlands in order to store water underground, and then building dams on surface to get their elevation change for pump storage. Now in South Africa, we've got old abandoned mines where coincidentally they're still having to pump the water out of them. They can't just leave them. So they're pumping the water out, and it's kind of slowly draining back in again. But if we can collect and channel the way it drains back in, we've got ourselves a pump storage solution where we already are pumping the water up. So that's one. The other one is that there's some very interesting storage technologies that involve taking things like old ash from coal plants or tailings from mine dumps and turning them into great big blocks of composite, and then lifting and lowering them in a gravitational kind of methodology. And then, of course, we've got vanadium flow cell batteries. So South Africa is one of the biggest, sits on some of the biggest vanadium deposits in the world. And we could build a whole vanadium flow cell. So we're not restricted to so-called lithium-ion batteries. We've got a number of hidden gems, and some of them, the repurposing of old mine dumps and the repurposing of old mine shafts, fall squarely in the purvey of the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy. It's a way of transforming many of these old gold mines and these old gold dumps into storage facilities. So we have fantastic possibilities in that field that leave one only but excited.
Thank you. Kristen, can I just come to you next, and then maybe I'll go to Craig more. Kristen, I just wanted to ask you, there's a question from Nick Headley on what is the ideal energy mix going to look like in 2035? If you can take that one, then we can ask our participants.
Yeah, ideal energy mix. Yeah, it's a difficult question. But in South Africa currently, I think it's very important to highlight that currently our IRP as it stands, the wind and solar resources that are planned as part of the IRP were limited somewhat in terms of how much we could be able to build on an annual basis, not necessarily based on actual technical simulations, but just based on some arbitrary rule that was put in there. But if we have to open that one up, and I would expect this to happen in the new IRP, we'll see a whole lot more wind and solar, which will be required. And of course, if it pushes for more storage, I think the ideas that Light is talking about are the type of things that we'll have to explore quickly to make sure that they will be able to complement the wind and solar that comes on board. But with the current IRP as it stands, up in 2030, I won't say it's the ideal mix, but wind and solar, they account for about 34% in terms of capacity, and in terms of energy, around 24%. And of course, I mean, like in 2030, I mean, with those percentages, we are still like very low in terms of where we'll actually require a whole lot of flexibility. But going beyond that, I will see the ideal mix in terms of renewables. I mean, this is like a subjective view from my side. The ideal mix in the long term, I will look at renewables moving even close to around 50–60% in the near future, if we have to do the modeling without restrictions. And with that, of course, the aspect of putting in new storage, new generation that will provide that flexibility to support the renewables will even become more critical and becomes more clearer to us as a country. And then we can be able to push for either adopting other technologies or maybe coming up with other avenues of making sure that we provide the storage required. Yeah, so with the current IRP, I would say what we have in there is quite limited. As a country, we can do much, much more. But with the new IRP, I hope those aspects will be quite clear. But by 2030, with the current IRP, energy mix is around 24%, which is still low in terms of what we can do as a country.
Shruti, may I chip in there? This is my meat and drink, this question. So I'm going to elbow my way in quickly and just say that by 2035 or beyond, doesn't really matter, the energy mix of the future will be something like 8 units of solar, 5 units of wind, and 3 units of storage, irrespective of how quickly we do that. That will be the ultimate mix. And so if we do that as quickly as we can, it can completely allow us to shut down the coal fleet by 2035. and it'll be economically justifiable to do so just on operation costs and the cost of coal, having written off the capital costs. If the limiting step is our ability to build as fast as we need to, but those are the ratios. They may vary slightly. The ratio of wind and solar might change a bit depending on how the cost curves develop over the next decade, but it's more or less 853. And it's quite pleasant in trying to get ourselves close to a natural world, is that it just happens to be the Fibonacci series. So 853 is part of the Fibonacci series, and 5 units of solar produce about the same energy as 8 units of solar produce approximately the same amount of energy as 5 units of wind. So you would have an equal output of wind and solar, and that would need to be balanced by 3 units of storage with 8 hours duration. And that will give us complete security of supply. And it's just a question of how much of that excess we would like to explore all the exciting possibilities of green hydrogen, desalination of water for Becher, e-mobility, transitions in the transport sectors, etc. So that's the mix we need. 8, 5, 3, easy to remember, El Fibonacci. Thank you.
Thanks, Clyde. That's a great cue. I've got Craig Morrell. Craig, can I ask you to unmute yourself and please introduce and then ask your question?
Sure. Thank you very much. And hello to everyone, especially the panelists who I know. We see a degree of silence in this report on onshore gas in particular. Obviously, I haven't had the benefit of seeing the full report and only what has been presented to us today. But based on that, there are certain assumptions of an energy mix that are based on the technoeconomics and the cost of gas being imported in the form of LNG that may or may not be true. But to ignore onshore gas and its costs and availability as a natural resource available in South Africa, we are missing then the opportunity to debate the relevance of onshore gas, and not only shale gas. Shale gas is only one type of onshore gas. We also have coal bed methane, shallow gas, conventional gas that, according to geological data provided by listed entities who are listed on various stock exchanges, the geological data is there for all to see, and that geological data is verified by independent third-party agencies. So its credibility is undoubted. Now, given that, it changes the potential future energy mix should that onshore gas be available in the next 3 to 5 years, and the potential that it could be priced in South African rand, given that the input cost of onshore gas is predominantly, estimate around about 70% of the input cost is denominated in rand. Now, if we then look at an energy mix that could include indigenous gas onshore and offshore, we are not only talking about LNG. LNG has its role to play. Then we need to redefine really what transitional role gas could play. So the question then is, to anyone, why this is not included in the report. And again, I must disclaim that it is based on the presentation today, not the full report. We haven't had benefit of that yet. And then what the transitional role of gas could do, in addition to avoiding the stranded asset issue, locking in supply, locking in demand, and to speak to Crescent's point, how an overall integrated energy plan could incrementally plan this transition to avoid such stranded assets, lock-in of supply and demand. Thank you. Sorry, just one last comment. I must ask why there is no one from any of the gas industry bodies present today in terms of your panelists. I think the debate and the achievement of evidence-based consensus is key, and therefore the diversity of views, including from the gas industry about whom you are talking, is vital to this debate.
Craig, thank you for your question and your comment. I'll ask my colleague Richard Halsey to come in on that. But meanwhile, can I just ask the panelists to also respond to the question that Craig raised?
Okay, so maybe I can come in first quickly. Thanks, Craig, for the comments. So firstly on that, what we put towards the end of the report is this idea of addressing knowledge gaps. Now, one of those is the way storage has dramatically changed in price in the last couple of years. And if something like onshore reserves is going to fundamentally change the price of gas, then that is another factor that could come into this idea of disruption that is happening in the energy sector. If suddenly there is a supply of gas that is going to be a lot cheaper than the estimates that all the modeling teams have currently used, then that is something which should also be looked at. So in that sense, in the short term, that's the sort of the knowledge gaps that we're looking for, is to like, there's quite a lot of change happening. And if that type of gas supply wasn't available in 2019 or when a lot of the recent modeling work is done, then very true, that should be included. In terms of the representation of the panel, as per what Shruti mentioned earlier, we've been in touch with Eskom and the Department of Energy about being on the panel. I was passed around from various people. Some of them are traveling and couldn't make it, and in the end they didn't join the panel. And that was our idea, to have a panel of 5, is because Eskom and DMRE are the people in terms of gas to power who would be involved in that. Because again, our report is only looking at what happens in the power sector. So you have the department planning around that, and you have Eskom who need to implement it. And as I say, we left space open till them until yesterday, but they didn't take us up on that. So yeah, over to anyone else who wants to comment.
I can chip in if I may, if it's not being a bit pushy. Hi, Craig. Nice to some good questions. My first response would be there's going to be a shortage of gas supply for many of the existing commercial users of gas. In other words, gas to liquids, gas to chemicals. And so it would be interesting to see the quantums of expected local gas from these sources that you mentioned, Renogen and others. And they would probably work quite nicely to fill that gap from the Romco pipeline that is looming. My personal opinion is that gas to power as such has a very limited, if any, role to play. So I would encourage those local gas off-takers to be looking to supply gas to people who currently make use of gas ported in from Mozambique. And then just the other question is, last time I filled up at Sasol from local petrol made from coal, I didn't notice any difference in the pricing. So I think this notion of different pricing, if I were producing gas and could export it at $30 a unit instead of selling it at $3 a unit locally, I would be questioning my intelligence of entering into a long-term contract that locked it in at a price plus basis. That's just a thought. It's nice to think in those terms, but certainly that gas will come in handy. But as gas to power, these better ways of doing it there's better ways of producing power more cost effectively. Thanks.
Just on the point around the gas master plan that Craig raised, I find the gas master plan a very odd document, and I've tried reading it several times and don't really understand the case that it's trying to make, particularly in terms of the economic point. And the point Craig raised, I think, is very valid around cost differences, etc., for onshore gas. But the gas master plan does not make that case, and it doesn't bring modeling to the table on relative contributions, etc. And I think when we see an update potentially the gas master plan, that might be interesting to see that kind of evidence if it does indeed exist. But to Clyde's point, and I think this comes back to sort of my hat of funding and banking. Gas is going to happen, right? Eskom has very clearly said that they are going to convert HCGTs, that they are interested in gas being maybe a much larger percentage of the system than some others would like. And I think this isn't about, for me, in the sort of the status quo, what's actually going to happen. It's not about no gas, right? By the system as Clyde has laid out, but the specifics here, I think, why the report is interesting is to think about what the more idealized system would actually be.
Thank you. I've got, Peter, while I've got you unmuted, I've got another question on the industry and how the industry can sort of, if it can afford gas, and if not, what are the alternatives for it, and how can it sort of diversify its electricity sources? Can you take that question as well?
In terms of industry more broadly, I mean, I think we are seeing this problem at the moment of the pace of rollout of renewables for embedded and wheel generation. On the one hand, which is much slower than we would like, versus on the other side, I think a lot of hard to abate industries struggling to see a proper timeline at the moment on hydrogen coming through. I think to one of Nick's questions in the chat, and where we need a much bigger policy plan, if you like, as Crescent said, in terms of an IEP, which should include hydrogen as well. I mean, I think this is where industry, I think, is struggling at the moment to timeline these different issues and the development of these different industries. I think that is making it hard. I think we are seeing obviously some RFPs coming out from various companies, including Sasol on gas. And that's then generating a lot of conversations on the flip side with shareholders in particular about why this is happening, about how this can be credible as part of transition plans. But yes, maybe some other panelists have some other views on the industrialization point.
Thank you. We've got a participant who can now unmute themselves, introduce themselves, and then maybe ask their question. Tajasa, can you unmute and then introduce yourself?
Hi, Shruti, thank you. This is Chashu Bolarento. I'm from WWF, so the co-host. So thank you very much to all to Richard and all the panelists for this really interesting session and for the interesting questions as well. I just felt I have to come in a little bit from from an environmental point as well, because it's getting a little bit lost perhaps in these discussions around future electricity systems and stranded assets and all of that. But as I would actually like to start with, Craig prompted me to think about the issue of timelines in developing gas projects. He mentioned 3 to 5 years, and I hope he can perhaps provide some explanation for this 3 to 5 years that he mentioned, because from all the research we've done, it seems that the lead time to actually bring gas online commercially from the point of exploration, we're talking a decade plus. So if you look at the Rystad Energy database, for example, even in Norway, the average time it takes, from exploration to production is about 12 years. In South Africa, the average time in 16 years. I mean, we've had confirmed discoveries from the late 60s even. They've never seen light of day. So it's, considering what we've heard today also, where storage is going and how the demand profile is going to change, and all these disruptive technologies and all these alternative storage options coming online. Thinking now that, even if we start exploring today, we will probably not see anything commercially, from indigenous resources into the mid 2030s. By when it's likely to be, there is really this high risk of stranded assets. But to bring this back to the impact of exploration on the rights of indigenous people, on the environmental impacts. And let's not forget, these exploration techniques are very invasive. There is like a lot, as we've seen now with Shell and Seismic Service, there's a lot of popular opposition to it. And however big or small these impacts may be, they are unnecessary. They are, with every passing day, they are more and more likely to be unnecessary. So I think we shouldn't overlook the invasiveness and like the high environmental cost, of this right at the top of the supply chain, or the upstream part of it. It's not it's not something to be discounted as well. So yes, so I just wanted to make that point. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. That was a great point. I think we've come to the close, but I think discussion is great. And so what I can maybe do is I'll just give like maybe a minute and a half to each panelist to sort of answer any question that they think they wanted to, or maybe just share some thoughts so that we can start wrapping up the session. So maybe Clyde, if I can start with you and then go to Peter and Crescent, and also maybe Craig, if you have any sort of final thoughts.
Thanks very much. So I'd just like to summarize again that whatever we do, we should make it a transformation for the socio-political economic structure of South Africa. And I think we have the opportunity to do that. I also just would like to end off with touching on endowment, because I think Peter mentioned the word endowment quite often, and I'm actually a resource geologist. The difference between an endowment, a resource, and a reserve is that an endowment is there. It becomes a resource when you find out that it's there and you think it might be economic, and it becomes a reserve when you can show that it has an economic tenure to it, that it's worthwhile doing. And my contention at the moment is that many of our so-called endowments, like the 200 years of coal that we still have, are still endowments, but they're no longer resources or reserves because they're not economic in the future. And so it's very important to realize the difference between an endowment, a resource, and a reserve. The Eastern Cape is actually endowed with a lot of gold, but it's not economically extractable. If you took the average amount of gold just as a background noise, there's plenty of gold in the Eastern Cape, but none of it is concentrated in such a way that it's economically extractable. And I think the one big one, as we sit here, I'm looking at the sun streaming down outside my house, and I'm thinking how many photons we let get away today. Thank you.
Peter, do you want to come in?
Sure, thank you. No, I think it's been a great discussion. I think the report, as I said earlier, is a great contribution to this idea that we do have a limited amount of time, and these windows are closing. There are a lot of forces coming to bear on the situation that banks and investors are considering very carefully. But I think we need to sort of think about what next now. I think we are going to see an increasing amount of contestation as Eskom moves forward with various plans on this front. We have a gas round of 3 gigawatts coming up from the IPP office. To Jas's point, wrapping in the Shell case and various other things, we're seeing, I think, a tightening of the legal space, certainly around how exploration, how communities are dealt with, and that's an increasingly important factor also to bring to bear as well. But no, I think we probably will round off this year with some very interesting outputs from the Presidential Climate Commission on the fuel mix, on the role of gas, etc. And that's, I think, and then more reports like this coming out from others. There's a lot of work going on by a number of different actors on gas. And I think as we get towards the maybe the end of the year, we'll have, I think, maybe hopefully that evidence base or the consensus that Richard hinted at starting to form, which will provide a much more certain backdrop for banks, for investors. Thanks.
Crescent, can I come to you next?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, on my side, I mean, every time when we discuss this, I always feel like we are being let down by the short range IRP that we currently have. And I know Clyde has got his own modeling that he has done on the side to look into the future, which is great. And I think the sooner we have the revised IRP, in my view, the better. And if anything, the drive for having an IEP should get the strong focus that it requires. At the moment, I think there's just no movement in that space in terms of the IEP for the country, and that's the critical document that should actually drive what we do across all sectors. And in our view from the research side, of course, we see the electricity sector as an anchor into the future in terms of how you move energy across all sectors. And that aspect at the moment is just like an idea that, of course, we see happening all over the world. But I think locally, once we have this IRP, which can be linked to the IEP, and we start to see that link in terms of how the energy moves across all sectors in the economy, I think the better. And then we can be able to have like more stronger cases, evidence for why we move into certain directions in terms of specific technologies. But now discussing technologies on a side by themselves, sometimes, of course, we might miss the bigger picture. But I think, but this report actually at least starts that conversation, and people who have got a different view, at least they'll start to think. Thank you.
Thank you. Craig, can I come to you? I saw a very active conversation happening in the chat window. So maybe if you want to share some final thoughts or any comments.
Sorry, Shruti, are you inviting me to chat quickly?
Yes.
Okay, so I think the valid points have been made by all of the panelists, and some certainly valid comments and questions asked in the Q&A. I'd like to leave the panelists and audience, IISD, WWF, with the following thoughts. Linked to what Crescent just said, we need to refine our master planning so that it more clearly spells out the incremental transitional steps and what role each of the technologies will play in that transition. This obviously requires an update of the IRP to define an IEP to as far ahead as 2050, when I think we've all agreed would be the ideal date to achieve net zero by 2050, right? That master planning does require evidence-based consensus. There are gaps in that evidence, which I think Richard also acknowledged earlier. We need to get going on developing that consensus and not continue working in silos. Last comment is on the statement made by the WWF colleague. Agreed, the environment is important and is not covered adequately in this debate, but so too was the absence of a discussion on socioeconomic challenges that we need to address through our just energy transition for it to be socially just and not only environmentally just. Section 24 of our Constitution refers to a definition of sustainable development that includes both environmental and developmental imperatives that are not mutually exclusive, but should be harmonized going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And before we close, can I just invite my colleague, Richard Halsey?
Great. So just answering some of the questions in the chat. All right. Yeah. So thanks to everyone who got involved with the discussion, all the panelists, Craig and Tasha for coming on and adding to the debate. And I think debate is the key word here. We know that this gas issue is controversial. It is contested. We know people have strong views on it, and I really appreciate that everyone approached this today from a very respectful manner. And again, just to remind people that, I mean, like Tasha mentioned some of the environmental impacts. We didn't actually look at those at all in the report. You know, our idea was to try and have quite a specific focus on just answering a question around the power sector. So we haven't looked at environmental impacts the same way as we haven't looked at some of the things that Craig mentioned around, you know, alternative and new sources of gas and what they could be used for. And as we saw in the chat, and as Clyde alluded to, there may well still be off-takers for those that are just not in the power sector. And that is part of the bigger debate. What is the bigger energy debate in South Africa involved? And we just hope that our small intervention on the power sector provides useful, and that we can have more conversations on how best to move forward as a country. And just again, thanks to everyone. I mean, it was in developing the report, I had lots of help from lots of people. I had lots of interviews. I had all sorts of things. And yeah, we just appreciate that. And for everyone who contributed to the valuable discussion today, really appreciate it.
Thank you. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. This is pretty much a wrap. I'm sorry for that we extended beyond time, but I'm grateful to all the participants and the panelists for their thoughts and the very rich discussion we had today. Again, many thanks. And we'll be in touch with all of you with the resources that were shared today. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you.